Okay, welcome back. This is Chapter 13, the Lucky 13. Actually, it is kind of sort of lucky because this is the last chapter of lecture you're going to have in the course, so I guess it is lucky. All right. If you recall from before, we talked about the six, depending on how you count, 6 steps of the system development lifecycle, and the previous chapter was on the first 3, which was doing some sort of investigation, analysis, and design. And so now we're going to do the other 3, which you can tell by just looking at the title. There's actually 4. Not exactly certain how the author can't count to 7, but that's okay. So let's continue. Let's talk about the objectives for this particular setup. So what are you supposed to learn this chapter? And it's going to be, all about the purpose for the construction, integration, and testing and implementation phases. Discuss the primary activities associated with each one of those guys. State the importance of system operations. Yep. Identify and discuss some of the activities and describe the system review process. And then identify advantages and disadvantages for using the SDLC, because there are alternatives. And so we'll talk about that. Key aspects of each one of these things. Identify the most common causes for system failures. Yeah, that's pretty cool. And identify project management tools that can use to track and monitor system development projects. Okay, so as always, I like to go to the gold section. And the gold section is all about, why do I need to learn this? And so this is, again, one of those things where even if you're not a system developer, you still need to know how this stuff works. Because your participation in building one of these systems is kind of critical. If you don't know what you're doing, you really won't be in a position to help. So, again, you want to be the person in the office that people go to and say, you know an awful lot about this. Why don't you help on the development team? Okay, that makes you more valuable than the rest of the employees, right? Okay, just checking. All right, before we even get into this chapter, let's do just a tiny bit of review of the previous chapter. And I'm going to add a couple of embellishing remarks into the previous phases. So one more time, let's talk about what the first 3 phases do. Okay, so the first phase is, what the heck is the problem? And if you don't get that right, your solution is probably going to be dumb. The second one is, what do I have to do? What are the requirements? And then the third phase is, what do I got to do to make those requirements happen? Okay, so one is, what is the problem? What does it need to do? And how am I going to make it do that? Those are the 3 things. Now let's talk about some of the more that you could throw in there. Because requirements are kind of key to this thing, it would be kind of cool if you had some sort of a requirements tracking system. They're actually out there is a piece of software that you type in all the requirements of the system. And let me tell you, you might think, well, this is kind of dumb. Why would you want to keep track of that? You could just put that on a bulletin board. It's more complicated than that. In real world, unless you assign a person to be responsible for a particular feature, let's say you're the person who does the reporting feature, okay? And the requirement is, must have the following reports. And so unless you assign a person that says you are responsible for producing these reports, then just assuming that it's going to happen is not a plan. So there is software out there specifically for doing requirements tracking. So once I got through phase 2 and ended up with requirements, I enter that into the system and I track the requirements, because I know of projects that get all the way down to the end and they go, here it is. Isn't it nice? And somebody raises their hand from the back of the room and says, yeah, but what about this? And they go, oh, shit, we forgot. Well, you don't ever want to forget. So requirements tracking is very, 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 very important. All right. Now, let's add a little bit more embellishing remarks on phase 3. There's a phenomenon that you probably have been aware if you've ever been through one of these things before, and that is, once I develop a list of all the things I'm going to do and I come up with the design specification, so I've been through the design and said, here's my specifications. At the end of that, you probably ought to lock them down, because if you don't, if anybody can just raise their hand and say, yeah, but I want to do voice recognition, there'll be an unending appetite for changes, non-stop. And so you really have to be able to say, no, I'm sorry, we're at the point where we're going to lock this thing down and no more changes are required. That's a great idea, but we'll do that in Rev 2 because we're full steam ahead on Rev 1. Okay. There's even a ridiculous acronym for this, and I learned this in the Army. It was called the Good Idea Cutoff Point. The GICOP, have it up. Good Idea Cutoff Point. In other words, you've got to the point where, okay, that's fine, but we've already picked a direction we're going to go, and I don't want to, no more good ideas. We need to quit talking, and we need to go do some action. Okay. So this is very important in this traditional SDLC setup, is that you make it difficult for people to come back and say, but wait, I wanted to add this feature that you had never heard of before anytime during the first 3 phases, okay? It'll happen, and you need to be able to tell them no. So what most people do is they basically sign off, and everyone, all the stakeholders, sign a document that says this is the list of requirements. And this is what we're building. And it's very important that you then go ahead and say, and here are the list of things that we received during development, but are not going to use. Because if you can't have something missing by omission. That made no sense, but you know what I'm talking about. You can't just say, well, they didn't say anything about it, so I just assumed it was there. So you need to give them a list of things that are approved, and then a list of things that are not approved. If you don't do that, they're going to assume that thing that they mentioned 5 weeks ago in a meeting is going to make it into the final product because you never told them otherwise. So it's very important that you go through and say, here's what we're going forward on and here's what we're not. Okay, now we're ready for this chapter. Okay. Whew. All right, phase 4 in this basically thing is the construction of the system. All right, so I've already designed, I've got a set of specifications. Now it's time to actually buy things, build things, and put things together. So they talk about these major steps, and we'll go through them, acquiring the hardware and software and all the rest of those things. Okay, so essentially acquiring the hardware is not all that difficult. Most people do turnkey. In other words, they hire a vendor to come in and buy the hardware and servers, etc., and come and set it up themselves. You could just open the cardboard boxes yourself and plug everything in and install your own software and do everything and do your own testing. That would work. But some of the stuff might be a little complicated, and maybe you need a little level of expertise on how to set up that RAID controller. Because when you set it up, it's going to ask you umpteen gazillion questions. And if you don't know how to answer them, you're probably going to do it wrong. So most people just basically go with a turnkey. Now, obviously, this whole model of acquiring hardware was kind of the traditional approach, and then clearly you think about the lease option and the cloud option and all the rest of the things. It could be that the hardware is not on your premises at all. It could be at somebody else's place, or could be in the cloud and you never see it. So anyway, the idea is now that you got a list of things you're going to buy, well, then you have to go out and buy it. That's pretty straightforward, I would think. Okay. After that, you have to acquire and install the software. And again, this is a little complex because let's say you're installing a brand new database. And once again, it's going to ask you umpteen gazillion questions. And if you've never done this before, you're probably not going to get it right the first time. So once again, it'd be kind of cool if you had somebody else come in and set all this stuff up. And of course, there's licensing agreements and all the rest of the things you have to deal with. So whether or not this is an in-house build or a commercial off-the-shelf COTS build is kind of part of this equation. Remember, we also talked about software as a service. That kind of refers back to the whole cloud computing kind of a thing, where maybe my database isn't here, and I don't have to buy a server and buy a database product and install it and configure it. I'll just have a database in the cloud, and what software they're using is no concern of mine, and I didn't have to install it or anything. So again, this is kind of old school. acquiring and installing software because of cloud computing makes it a heck of a lot easier. You could, of course, write your own. If you remember from previous chapter, there was some pros and cons between, acquiring your own software. Writing your own software versus buying commercial off-the-shelf. So, remember, one of them was very quick and one was very expensive and all the rest of that stuff. One of the things that kind of comes up is you probably end up with some sort of technical documentations. So if you have somebody coding your own stuff, now you could be the coder, or you could hire a third party to do their coding. All right, either way. But anyway, if you have to do your own, this step is probably part of it. One of the things that this thing can do is it can produce two different types of documentation. This technical documentation this is more like one computer professional talking to another computer professional, and they're talking about, how did I configure the server and how did I configure the database, and the primary keys and field links, and very, very technical stuff. It's very, very important. If you ever had to reinstall this thing, you'd have the technical documentation. Now, if the average user picked up a technical documentation and looked at it, they would go, what on earth? What's that acronym? Because it's not designed for the average user. It's designed for one technical person talking to another. User documentation, of course, is exactly talking to the user. So what is it do I have to do? What button do I push to make it do this? Where are the help menus and things of that nature? Okay. So people who are coding this system probably have to produce this stuff for you. If it's not commercial off the shelf, there's going to be no other source of this kind of information, right? If you're writing it or having it written, they're the only ones that can produce this. Okay, let's continue. The next thing to talk about is the database part. So creating a new database, again, if you've never done that before, leave that to the professionals because you can make some horrible choices. But I will tell you that this is not quite as clean as it might think. So let's say, for example, here's your existing system. In my existing system, I have 2-3 databases, and I do all this stuff. And so I go through and I have to get data out of my old and put it into my new. And so over here, I had the address as all one field. It was, 123 any street, any town, any state, any zip. It was all in one field. And the new database has a separate field for the street address, separate field for the city and the state and the zip. So I have to convert these guys and break them apart. All right, so I gather all this data and I reformat it. And then I merge it all back together and stuff it into the new system. Now, I will tell you, this is somewhat fraught with problems. Let me explain. Let's say you have a contract that's going to do all this. And what the contract will probably read is they are responsible for doing the data conversion with a little asterisk that says, and the user is responsible for fixing any errors. In other words, they're going to take your old data, crunch it through the mill, and say, okay, 300,000 rows converted just fine, but these 50,000 rows need some work, and they're going to hand it back to you and say, fix it. If you're not prepared for that, you're going to think, oh my God, I don't have time for this. I'm going to have a full-time person sit there and go through and fix this stuff. So yeah, you need to read the contract. You need to make sure who is responsible for fixing the data that does not convert. It's very important. I have been through one of these, and it was a royal pain in the ass because we went through and we got the first batch, and then he came back and said, well, okay, well now we got 10,000 records that didn't work, and then now we got 2,000 records that didn't work, and they did it again. Man, now we have 200 records that didn't work. And we just had to go over and over and over, and it was a heck of a lot of a burden. Okay, this is a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll pick this thing up in just a few.